Welcome back. So today we want to talk about main memory. View logistics. So if you remember module 9, the previous lecture on last Monday, we didn't fully finish the lecture. What I'm going to do is that I actually recorded the video. I'm gonna post it today. It's a shorter video. It's like a 30 minutes-ish, hopefully. That you can watch. The reason is that we have some canceled classes. They're gonna be also a holiday next week. So I just wanted to move on to the next module. So just watch that in your free time.
Which one?
What's that?
Oh, the module 9.
Yeah, the second part of module 9 when we were talking about utility-based cache sharing. So it's about like a multi-core cache sharing. We talked about replacement policy, if you remember, but we didn't finish the few slides at the end.
Okay.
So just it's going to be posted as kind of part 2 in the website. So you're going to see like, the same place that you saw the video for module 2. It's already there. I haven't just linked the video. So just keep that in mind and watch that. Make sure to watch that before the exam. Computer assignment 2, it's extended to Friday so that you have a little bit more time. And on Gradescope, it shows as late, but there's no penalty. Just to kind of distinguish between people who submitted today versus on Friday. Don't forget the paper reviews and presentations. We're gonna have another round on Wednesday. And then we're gonna have 2 more computer assignments. The next one gonna be released on Friday about cache replacement policy. It's a championship. And then the last one would be released at week 9, I think, if we have the times correctly. And then it will be about scheduling of main memory, which would be the topic that we're gonna hopefully cover today, most of it. Okay, that's also a championship. So that's kind of the schedule for the remaining computer assignments. The last 2, the ones that you're doing right now is the most time-consuming ones. The other 2 is similar to the first one. It's kind of like on you how much time you want to spend on it. The last one, the deadline would be the finals week, so you'll have the finals week to work on this one. Questions? All right. So this is a picture that we had talked about last week as well, that we want to have memory hierarchy, to have multiple layers of memory for different size and speed. We mainly focus on cache so far. We talked about advanced cache and these different kind of like, features. Hopefully you have time and watch the previous videos as well. We also last Monday, we talked about replacement policy. We talked about various different strategies, like BIP and DIP and DRIP and so on. And as I said, C8 number 3 would be based on those. So you can actually have to spend a little bit more time on that. And then if you remember, essentially like the difference between these replacement policies were, what do we do? Well, like what do we evict when we want to install a new line? Where do we put it? And then what do we do for promotion? When there is a hit, what do we do? So these are the main 3 things that you really need to decide. And ultimately, any replacement policy can be summarized into this. And if you remember last time, we talked about like this dynamic policies, different solutions, you're monitoring some part of the cache, monitor some other part of the cache, then you decide which one you want to do. And the reason for that was like, your behavior changes over time, your application changes, and so on and so forth. The part that we didn't cover last time was when we have sharing the cache between the cores. How do we decide how much space should be assigned to each cache? Should we let the applications decide? Should we intervene somehow, provide some policies and stuff like that? In the video that is going to be posted today, you're going to see that we're going to talk about this utility-based cache partitioning and why it matters and why it helps us. Okay? Any questions about these last week's lecture? Cool. So today I want to talk about the main memory. So we're going to go one step lower and we're going to talk about the DRAM. And we're going to talk about the design of the DRAM, And then we're going to talk about performance issues for DRAM. And lastly, we're going to talk about security issues with DRAM, specifically rowhammer. I'm going to just give you an introduction for rowhammer today. And the next lecture going to be more detailed about rowhammer attacks and defenses, because that's an important and an emerging topic. This next few slides is mainly driven from Professor Qureshi from Georgia Tech, which is also driven from Professor Muslu at CMU. So just an acknowledgement. All right. So what is a main memory system? So so far we kind of covered this left part of a system, but any advanced system requires a lot of memory, especially these days. We need a lot of memory for bringing data in and out, especially since we are dealing with like large scale data, such as like large language models or deep neural networks. So where that data resides, the data mostly resides on DRAM. And then the part that I'm not showing here is also usually there's another one that is your disk, right? So your disk is also kind of sitting here, even further away from the CPU. And that's where you get the bulky kind of data storage. So this is usually in order of terabytes, right? This is in order of gigabytes. And here it's order of these caches, it's order of kilobytes or even few megabytes, right? So that's the difference between these levels of memory that you see. And of course, this is like really, really slow. We're not going to talk about this just very quickly. In the past, long time ago, this was like, this mechanical kind of like, hard drive disks that use kind of like usually a laser and some form of a movement in order to read data. These days, most of them are the solid state based, technologies like NAND, flash, or other technologies that are much faster and much efficient in terms of size. One trick that these disks do is that they actually add another layer of DRAM on top of it. So most of these disks these days also has a small DRAM on it. They call it DRAM cache. So think about it the way that cache operates for DRAM, DRAM operates as a cache for the disk as well. So there are many things that are kind of shared in the terms of context with similar to here. But as I said, we're not going to go very deep into the disk. We're going to mainly just focus on this one. So that we have a cache and we have a DRAM. Let's talk about that. Okay. So you can think about a DRAM and generally memory organization as a 2D array. The address comes, okay. Then you usually register the address because this process of reading the data from the memory takes multiple cycles. As I showed you before and discussed it before, is usually hundreds or even thousands of cycles. So you want to maintain this. So this is where CPU needs to wait, right? So if you don't have like an out of order or multi-core system, then basically once the CPU provides the address, it waits until the data goes through this electric process and gets this data back. Unfortunately, if you remember, I told you about memory gap initially in the first lecture, where speed of the processor goes like 2x in 2 years or so, but memory is fairly flat because the technology is different. So unfortunately, as we are going to smaller and smaller technologies, this memory delay is a huge bottleneck. But anyway, but once we register it, then we typically divide the data into two parts, most significant bits and least significant bits. These are multiple bits, it's not just one bit. Then we select the row. So usually we have a row decoder. For those of you not familiar with the decoder is a logical unit that takes an input and then select one of these lines. It's the opposite of a multiplexer, which you provide multiple lines and you select one of them. This is kind of the opposite. So for example, let's say your most significant bit says that you have to select the fifth row. So it's activate this row and it reads the entire row and put it into some form of a row buffer that we are not showing you here. But then within this, it's a 2D array. So within this, there are multiple columns. So this is where this lower significant bits is basically decode the column and then selects one as the data out. So this is basically the simple operation of reading a memory. So it's 5 steps. So we decode the raw address and derive the word lines. We select the bit lines. We read the data. Actually, I think I have a better picture too. So let me just move forward from this. Yes, this is actually a better picture. So if you actually like zoom in into this, this is how we actually like, how you read this. First of all, if you remember, I told you that we have 2 technology. We have the SRAM technology and we have the DRAM technology. SRAM technology is usually used for L1 and L2 caches. It's much faster than DRAM, but it requires more power and more area, okay? And DRAM technology is using a different technology and used for the main memory or the DRAM, okay? It's much slower, but it requires much less power and much less area, okay? So this is kind of the trade-offs. So let's see how SRAM works. If I want to make the SRAM really simple, SRAM is basically a back-to-back inverters, okay, connected to each other. That's how we actually kind of stores the data. So it's kind of like, you can think about this as this is kind of like traps in an infinite loop, right? So if I store 1 here, it will be 0 here, and it's always this 1 and 0 kind of like help each other. If I store 0 here, then here will be 1. So that basically is either 0, 1 or 1, 0. That's how we store things. But of course, you want to be able to read this value and write to this value, right? In order to read and write this value, there are these 2 transistors called access transistors. So when I want to read or write, I enable these access transistors and write this value or read this value into this cell, this SRAM cell. This SRAM cell, as I said, it's an inverter. You need 2 transistors for this one, 2 transistors for this one, and there are 2 transistors for access. That's why usually SRAM cell typically needs 6 transistors. Okay. There's a whole bunch of design. For those of you who have taken any VLSI course, you've probably seen this. But generally, important things about this SRAM is that the sizing of this transistor should be such that this can overpower this. So because we want to kind of write things to this. So these are usually much bigger transistors than these guys. But on the other hand, you don't want these to be significantly bigger than this one, because then reading becomes very difficult. This is very challenging to kind of like find the best sizing. But that's good news is that's not your problem because you're a computer architect. Someone just says that this works and you accept that, okay? So if this works, how you actually read this? So as you can see, there is a row select and there is a bit line, okay? Row select, as I said to you before, is when we actually select that row in the SRAM, okay? So we decode the address and drive this row select. Once this row select is selected, then these transistors become active. Okay. Once these transistors become active, then it's time for these guys to push their value out. Okay. So this one will push this value here. This one will push this value here. Okay. The reason that we have 2 is because we want to do this thing called differential sensing. Since this is very tiny cell, it doesn't have enough power to drive one line by its own. Okay. So the way that we do it, we use this trick that say, okay, these are 2 lines. Let's say I want to read either 0 or 1, okay? So what I do is that I pre-charge these lines to half, like 0, 1 over 2, okay? So whatever my high voltage is, I do half of it here and I do half of it here, okay? And then I let this cell to kind of drive these 2. Remember, these are back-to-back inverters, right? So one of them would be 0, one of them would be 1, right? So the one that is 0, what will happen is that the charge can go from this side to this side, right? Because this is lower potential, this is higher potential, the charge goes this side. From this one, the charge goes this side, okay? So after this period, what will happen is that once I, disconnect this access transistors, this line would be, for example, in this case, would be 1 + 2 minus some tiny epsilon because it loses some charge, right? And this guy would be 1/2 plus some tiny epsilon. Since this is symmetrical, typically this epsilon and that epsilon is pretty much the same, doesn't need to be, okay? And then these two lines goes into this amplifier called a sense amplifier or differential amplifier, that what it amplifies is not absolute values, but their difference. So you can amplify that very, significantly. And since there's actually like at least a 2 epsilon difference between them, it can actually catch that. So as long as this differential power amplifier is sensitive enough that it can differentiate the 2 epsilon, then it can actually read this value correctly. Okay, so that's how this SRAM works. And again, there are tons of works for those of you who are interested in analog design of like how do you design a sense amplifier and how do you design this access transistors and pre-charging and so on and so forth. So going here, the steps of reading is that you decode the address, you drive the row select, which means that you select this, then and then selected bits will drive the bit lines. So this is bit line, and this is the opposite of the bit line. Whatever this value is, this value always would be the opposite, right? So this will drive these cells. Then the differential sensing, it's going to sense that value. This is when you have the value. And then you need to pre-charge this lines to 1/2 again, because you want to do it for the next time. So usually the way we do it is these lines are always pre-charged. And then the next time we want to read it, we just do this access transistor. So another reason that you want these to be pre-charged is reducing the leakage. So you don't want to create a large, you want to minimize the difference with the potential difference between the two, part of the transistors to reduce the leakage. That's why you pre-charge. Okay. So this is how you read it. Important thing is that the access latency of reading an SRAM is dominated by part 2 and 3. Okay. And the general cycling time, because you want to read this multiple times, is that since you also need to do pre-charge, that also has a significant impact. So the cycling time is 2, 3, and 5. So 1 and 4 is really fast compared to 2, 3, and 4. Okay. You can also like show it this way. So let's say I have an input address of n plus m. N is the number of rows, and m is the number of columns, 2 to the power of n and 2 to the power of m. Okay. So 2 to the n is basically the number of rows, and 2 to the power is the number of columns. Important thing is that the latency of the steps is dependent on the size of the array. That's why, for example, L1 cache cannot go beyond like 32 kilobytes or 64 kilobytes, because as we increase this number of rows or number of columns, these delays increases. Why? Because you can think about this as like, when I charge this bit line, okay, this bit line is also connected to a lot of other transistors, right? All the SRAM cells are connected to this bit line. So this line will see a capacitance of all of these different cells. If I increase that number of cells, then it sees a larger capacitor. And when it needs to drive it, it needs to provide more charge to drive this large capacitance. That's why it takes more time, because it needs more charge, right? So more charge means more time, because the amount of charge that this one has is fixed. So if I need to drive a stronger line, it takes more time for me to do that, right? Because it just takes more electrons. So that's why the step number 2, this row select, obviously is proportional to 2 to the power of n. It depends on how many columns I'm gonna have, right? And then and step 3 and 5, the time it takes for these guys to drive, it depends on how many rows I have, right? So if I have more rows, then I need to drive more things. So just keep that in mind, and that's why our space is limited because remember that I told you that I want to maximize hit time for L1. That's why really 32 or 64 is the maximum I can do to do it within one cycle, which is like few nanoseconds. Okay? Make sense? Got a question?
This might be more hardware question, but
Yeah.
I'm curious, what is the difference between like a read and write for like is the write where we're setting the value of those that like inverter flash from the bit line?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So the inverter, so the writing is fairly similar to reading. So you also need to pre-charge and you also do differential writing. You don't need the sense amplifying. But again, it's slightly different because then you need to charge it slightly higher. So typically we pre-charge it to 1 and 0 instead of like 1 and 1.2 and 1.2. So that this can overpower this.
Right.
So that's the main thing about the write. But I just provided this detail. It's very like hardware digital logic, which is not something that you may want to need in your future life. But I think it's just useful to know a little bit of like how this basic things works. How many of you knew what was SRAM, how it works? Okay, a few of you. Good for you. All right, so this is the technology of SRAM. DRAM is a slightly different. DRAM is technically just one transistor and one capacitor. This capacitor itself is usually designed as a transistor, or sometimes you just engineer this particular transistor such that it has high capacitance. The way it works is that since there is no two axis, everything needs to be driven by just one line here, okay? So we have still a row enable, so the row enable select that particular cell. And then we just let this bit line to be driven by this capacitance, okay? This capacitance though, since it's like very, very small compared to this very large, it can only slightly reduce or slightly increase the charge of this line, okay? So how do we do that? How do we then sense that? We're gonna use this sense amplifier, but this time instead of having a differential sensing amplifier, we have what we call a flip-flopping sensing amplifier. The flip-flopping sensing amplifier is basically what it does is that if the value is slightly going down, it's lashed into 0. If the value is slightly goes up, it lashed into 1. So that's how it's actually quickly amplified us, okay? So it's like, it's very, very sensitive to tiny changes. If the tiny change goes upward, it just quickly go to up 1. So it's just how like it kind of mimic the behavior of a flip-flop, right? And then another thing that it needs to do is that it also needs to regenerate the value here, because essentially the problem with DRAM is that reading a value from a DRAM cell destroys the charge, because the charge is really small to begin with. And when you're reading it, you're kind of either depleting this charge or increasing the charge, right? So you want to be able to go back to the state that it was. So DRAM is one of the key reasons that it's much, much slower than SRAM. Number one is that it just has so little charge. So like driving this line takes significantly more amount of time. The second thing is that once I do that, I need to go back and recharge this capacitor. So this part is also time consuming. Whereas for SRAM, the reads does not destroy the value of the SRAM itself. Okay. And then another big problem with DRAM is that even if I don't read this, okay, even if I don't touch this row and I don't read this, since there is like a tiny bit of leakage between here and here and here and the ground, this capacitor lose charge over time. There is a non-zero amount of leakage for this capacitance. As a result, we need to refresh the DRAM. Okay, we need to usually refresh the DRAMs in tens of milliseconds, 30 milliseconds. Depends on the technology and depends on the generation. But we have to go through all the cells, regardless of whether we read it or not. We have to go and refresh them. So that's also an important part of a DRAM operation that requires refreshing. SRAM, we don't care. We don't need to refresh, but DRAM we need to. But keep in mind that both DRAM and SRAM are volatile memory, which means that the moment that you shut down your system and you disconnect the VDD, the voltage, the data will be lost. If you turn it on again, nothing is there. Okay. There's an interesting paper which we're actually going to talk about later next week, is about what they call cold boot attacks. So I just told you that if you turn off your computer, the data will be lost in DRAM. People have found that this is actually, it's not 0 and 1. This is not immediate. It takes some time. And they found that it's actually it's a function of temperature. So if the temperature drops, this losing behavior is actually much slower, because kind of you can think about it as like, your electrons are like moving slowly and slower as the temperature drops. So it's actually just losing the charge, the speeds reduces. So what they can do is that they found that if they can actually spray it with like, liquid nitrogen or something, so they kind of freeze it as much as they can actually retain the value up to like 10, 15 minutes. So what they do is that they like write everything that they want to the DRAM. They shut down the system. They spray the coal, whatever, liquid or air, whatever they have, and then they go and put this DRAM back into another device that they have full control over. So then they can actually extract all the secret information from the other one, because imagine that essentially everything that you have in your DRAM can be just ported into another device. Yeah.
How practical is this kind of thing in like real?
So this is introduced, I think, in like 2010, 2012. They actually have videos and all, and they show that it works very well.
Yeah, I mean, like in real life, who's going to be sneaky to a data center, spraying all the RAM with liquid nitrogen, and off of it?
Well, a spy would, right? So like so it's I mean, as these days things are changing, right? So as this like governments are now clashing, like imagine that I can just go into a super secretive like server room of a country X, which what that country is, and then try to like remove the data from them, and if it gives me like secret information, why not, right? Many of these kind of like physical attacks is mostly at state level, and it happens, right? Recently there's like we saw that I think you were were you in my IIT class or no? Last quarter? No, yeah. So there was this pagers. Have you heard about those pagers that they blow up?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So they, how much time they spend on that? So they actually build a company, like a shell company, a Taiwanese company. They sold this as like they had like brochures. They have CEO, like they hire people and they convince the other guys that this is a legitimate product. They sold it to them, and then like they had using it for 6 months or so, and then one day they decided to blow it up. So, yeah. But the funny thing about the cold boot attack is actually was introduced in Michigan, which is the place that you would see this, right?
Yeah.
This idea never like happens in San Diego or LA, right? Anyway, you had a question too? No? Oh, okay. All right. So going back, so we don't want to go sideways. So essentially, just looking back at the operation of DRAM, DRAM is pretty much the same thing. It just has 2 additional steps. So step 1 to 3 is the same. Instead of differential sensing and pre-charging, we just do flip-flopping and then pre-charging. Okay. And then if you actually look at the DRAM, you have the same N and M. This CAS and RAS is basically row address and column address. So this is just 2 registers to save the row address and the column access. And then here, you just read the 2 of N. You bring the entire 2 of M here. And then you read 1 byte. You select one of those columns, the same way that you read it from the string. Okay. Just a quick then comparison. SRAM is preferable for the register file L1, L2, fast access, no refresh, simpler manufacturing, lower density, higher cost. DRAM standalone memory chips, much higher capacity, higher density, lower cost. As you can see, like this one only needs one transistor, this one needs 6 transistors. So obviously, if you want to pack more things, you want to use DRAM, right? All right, so this is DRAM. So let's actually like focus a little bit more on DRAM for the rest of this lecture. So DRAM itself is kind of like a complicated system. It's a hierarchy of things. So DRAM has channels. Typically, most of the modern DRAMs have 2 channels. Then they have DIMM, and then they have ranks, and then multiple chips. Within those chips, they have multiple banks. Within those banks, they have multiple rows and columns. So let me actually break it down for you. All right. So most of the modern systems have multiple channels that can go to your CPU. This is where you can have those different slots of DRAM. So for example, you buy a better motherboard, it gives you like 8 slots or 4 slots. These slots is actually what allows you to connect more DRAMs to your system. If you don't have those channels, you cannot just like go and buy like 10 DRAMs and connect it to your PC, right? And of course, your processor should be able to support those channels, all right? So that's why when you're buying these things, you have to check your motherboard, you have to check your CPU to make sure that it works. But most of the modern systems have multiple channels. These are independent channels, right? So you can read data from one channel, you can read the data from the other channel, okay? So most systems at least have 2 channels. So that's why you have 1 bit if it's 0 or 1. So usually the most significant bit of the address decides which channel is this, okay? Then you have, for each memory, for each channel, you have this what we call a dual inline memory module, okay? A dual inline memory module means that in both sides of the memory module, you have chips, okay? So this side, you have like 8. On the other side, you also have 8. So that's why we call it the DIMM, okay? If you actually look at it like from the side, it's like a very small thickness. But then there's like a back of the DIMM and the front of the DIMM, okay? And so these are separate chips. They're not the same, okay? So we want to basically reduce the space, obviously. That's why we want to have this DIMM. Since we have 2 sides, we need to be able to differentiate these sides from each other. That's why we call them rank, okay? So one side of the DIMM is called, usually the front side is called rank 0. The back side is called rank 1, okay? And then since this is dual, you always have only rank 0 or rank 1, nothing else. Each rank usually has 8 chips. This is fairly standard. So each rank has 8 chips, so the total of 16 chips in any DRAM module, okay? So you can think about the kind of like the architectural or microarchitecture of this looks something like this, that the address comes, okay? The address goes into to both of these. Then you have this thing called chip selects that decide which of these ranks should be selected, okay? And it only needs 1 bit, right? So it only picks rank 1 or rank 2, and the data goes here and the data goes out, okay? So you send all the 64-bit address to both of them, you only select one of them. So what is happening within each rank? As I said, each rank has 8 different chips, okay? So what do we want to do in order to parallelize this? So the whole design of DRAM is that you can provide the data as fast as possible, right? So that's why you have multiple chips, multiple ranks, you know, both sides, multiple channels, and so on. So a rank which usually gets a 64-bit value, then divide this value equally to these chips, okay? So the 0 to 7-bit address goes to, 0 to 7-bit data goes to chip 0. The second one is provided by chip 1 and chip 2 and chip 3. So when we are actually reading a value, we usually involve all the chips at the same time from either rank 0 or rank 1. We can only read it from one side. We cannot read it from both sides. So what is happening within each chip? Each chip is usually designed in multiple banks. Usually we go with 8 banks, okay? So the banks are actually works in parallel. So that's why the data that they provide is not like bit 0, bit 1, bit 2, bit 3, but this one provides 1 byte, this one provides 1 byte, this one provides 1 byte, all of them providing 0 to 7. So as a result, when the memory access comes, we only need one of these banks. So for example, like the value comes and we select bank number 0. So that particular memory request is serviced by bank 0. The others are not active at that moment. Nice thing about this banking strategy is though that while I'm servicing this, I can maybe do other things in the other banks. So I can parallelize future requests, multiple requests, and stuff like that. But at any given time, I cannot provide 2 data at the same time. I can only provide 1. So there is some serialization going on with the banks. Okay. What happens within each bank? Then you're going to have that 2D array that we talked about. So the original picture that I showed you was the picture of a bank. Okay. So a bank is usually like, 2 kilobytes column width, and the rows really depends of how many rows. Usually we have 16K rows, but that really depends on the size of the DRAM that you buy. If you buy a big DRAM, then of course this number of rows grows, but we usually don't go beyond 2 kilobytes column size because that will significantly increase our capacities. Typically, each column needs, so remember that we always need byte addressable memory. That's why every single cell should be 1 byte. So this goes into this thing called row buffer. From this row buffer, you should be able to select the bits that you want. If it's 2 kilobytes, how many bits do I need for the addressing of this? 11 bits, right? So K, you need 10 bits for 1K and then another bit for 12K. So usually 11 bits you need to address 1 byte data for each bank. Yes.
What's the advantage of splitting the data in all the banks rather than just fill each bank one by one?
We're not splitting the data to banks, right? So if the request comes to chip 0, one of these banks will be selected and that bank will provide the data. The alternative would have been that one bank provide all the data. Is that what you're asking?
I think maybe it was the slide before, like we're splitting, here, like from the rank, like different bits into different.
Because then we can like in parallel access these, right? So if I want the 64-bit data, then I can read 1 byte from this, 1 byte from this, 1 byte from that. Otherwise, I would have gone, let's say if I have all the data in chip number 0, then I would need to read 8 bytes from one chip, right? And remember, reading was slow, right? Because 8 bytes means that I need to pre-charge the bit lines and all those stuff. So I want to be able to do that in parallel, right? So you want to parallelize that part, that I want to read them as fast as possible. Okay. So how do we transfer this into a cache block? We usually, as I said, we usually read 64-byte cache block in one go. Okay. So you can think about it as like, we can map this into like a 1 rank, 1 DIN, 1 channel, and so on, and then flip-flop between the channels, between the banks and between the ranks. The way that we read it, you can think about it this way, that reading this would need, for example, rank 0, chip number 0, 1, 2. So all of these 8 chips provide the data. Let's say, for example, all of them will provide the bank 0, like in all of them, and then particular row will be selected, and that's how we're gonna read this value. Row 0, column 0, row 1, column 1, and so on and so forth. You read this value one by one. Just keep in mind that essentially reading a 64 bytes data requires 8 consecutive reads, right? Because each one provides an 8 bytes. Okay, remember, each one was providing 1 byte, right? So each chip gives you 1 byte. We have 8 of this, so in one go we can provide 8 bytes at the maximum that we can. So if I want to read a full cache block, which is a 64-byte, I do this in 8 goes. right? So I read the first row, column 0, and then I go to row 0, column 1, and then I go to row 0, column 2, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is how I'm gonna read this value to build this 64. Okay. Why would I need to do that? Because I cannot go beyond 1 byte per read, because I want my memory to be byte addressable. And I cannot go beyond. So one thing is like, oh, can I do more than 8 chips at the same time? And usually, again, there are electrical issues that you cannot go beyond 8 chips. That's why you need to like do it this way. Okay. But as you can see, this is not too bad, because later on we're going to introduce the notion of row buffers. So essentially, you just read the columns once, and then the rest is just reading different. So you read one row once, and then the rest is reading the columns of that row. And that is significantly faster, because you can bring the whole row once, you store it in some form of a row buffer. And then the next time is that if it's within that row, you just can quickly just go and grab the data. So that's why the first 8 bytes is usually the slowest. The rest is fairly quick, as long as they're within the same row. Okay, just keep that in mind as well. Yeah, so this is just like, summarizing what I just said. So this notion of a row is also called a page. Okay, so if you heard the name page, is the same thing as a DRAM row. And then the amplifier, as I said, is usually called a row buffer. So we have 2 options when we are reading a value. It's called closed row and open row. Okay, closed row means that I'm gonna bring some value to the cache, to the row buffer. I'm gonna grab some data from it and put it into transfer it to the cache, and then I'm gonna close this row, which means that I'm gonna write this back to whatever it was, and then I move on. Okay, this is usually called a closed row. Okay, the open row means that I expecting that this row gonna be used again in future. So I'm not gonna rewrite this. I'm gonna keep it open, and then I'm gonna let it continue, so that if the next time, for example, I need to read this value, I can immediately forward it. So if I actually look at the to the steps for a closed row, you need to activate a row. You need to go and grab the row and write it to the row buffer. You also need to close it, go read it, write it back, and pre-charge it. For open row, activation is no longer needed, right? So you just read the row buffer, you pre-charge it, and you move on. Okay, so the row is already there. So what is the trade-off between these two? The trade-off is this, that if I have a row already open, and if my next access is within the same row, I'm gonna save a lot, because I don't need to activate the row anymore. But if the next access is not within that row and from some other row, then I'm gonna pay a penalty, because now I need to not only close this row, so I need to write this back, then I need to pre-charge the next one, right? And this is within my critical path, right? So this pre-charge part is not within the critical path, because at the moment that I have the data, I can forward that to the cache, and in the background, I can pre-charge. So I'm saving a lot of time. But if I don't do this pre-charge, and I keep the row active, then the next time I need to basically pre-charge, activate, and then read. So I'm spending more time. So I'm basically gambling. If I observe that there is lots of opportunity for reuse, then I would want to keep my row open. But keeping my row open means that if by any chance this is a miss, then I need to spend more time. So then it's kind of like a question of whether I want to be aggressive and keep the row open, or whether I want to close it and then each time go to the next one. That's a very, very fundamental question for most of these DRAM operations. Yeah.
Is there a kind of like prediction mechanism, like branch prediction, that is used for this too?
Yes, so you can actually do prediction, and that would be, again, this is your CA number 4, that you need to kind of like decide whether you want to do closed row or open row, and there's a few other things that we're going to talk about. So this is exactly what you need to kind of predict. Yeah, so it's kind of like, to give you a little bit more insight into why it matters that the row is open or not, is that let's say you have a sequence of addresses like this. So I have row 0, column 0, the first axis. When I have that, it basically means that I bring this and put it in the row buffer, and then I forward this value to the cache. Okay. The next one comes, and if I have the open row, I already have this value here. So then basically all it takes is that just taking this value and forward it. So much faster than opening a row and then reading it. And then I can continue doing that. For example, if the next one is column 85, again, I can just directly forward this. Well, of course, the penalty I'm going to pay is when this happens. Then now I need to close this row, put it back, bring the next row, and then forward this value. So I need to pay that penalty one time. Okay? And again, this is the overall end-to-end latency of an access. So the CPU needs to transfer that address through its controller. The controller needs to, so usually we have the marker architecture looks like this. So you have a CPU, you have what we call a DRAM controller, which is usually installed on the side of the CPU, which then talks to your DRAM. Okay. So if I want to read something, first I need to send this request from the CPU to the DRAM controller. DRAM controller needs to receive this and queue it because there might be many, many requests. So there is a delay for queuing and scheduling. Then you need to basically issue this command to the DRAM. So there will be some time for transferring that. And then there will be time for actually reading that value, right? So so reading that value, there are different cases, right? So if the row is already open and you have a row buffer hit, then you just have a column access is the only time that you need, right? If not, if you have the closed row, then you always pay this penalty of row access, column access. If you always do the closed row, you always do the pre-charge in the background, right? But then if you have an open row, but you miss on your row buffer, then you have a pre-charge, row access, and column access. Okay, so there are 3 possible access time for a DRAM. The most optimal one is that the row is open and you hit on the row buffer. The kind of a medium option is that when you always do closed row, which means that you always pre-charge and write it back, but in that case, you always pay RAS plus CAS. And then the worst case is when you pay pre plus RAS plus CAS. This is when you have an open row and you miss. And then, of course, once you read this value, you send it back to the CPU. So if you add all these times together, that would be your DRAM latency, okay? Which mostly dominated by this part and to some extent this part. So your control logic also matters and how fast you can issue this control logic. But mostly really this is the part that is the most dominant part in DRAM latency, okay? To give you some numbers, if I have an open page policy and keep using it, a row buffer hit typically takes around 12.5 nanoseconds. These values are previous generation, so these are slightly changed. Pre-charge plus RAS per CAS is 37.5. This is when you have an open row and you miss. If I have a closed page, as I said, you always have a deterministic time. You always do the RAS plus CAS, which is 25 nanoseconds. Okay? So now you can actually decide, right? So here you have a weighted average between these 2 values. Here you always pay this penalty. So now the question is, do I have to, which one should I use? Depends on your row buffer hit rate. If it's better than 50%, then it makes sense to have an open row policy. If it's less than 50%, then it's not, right? So that's what you need to decide as a designer. All right, so let's have a quick break. Then we're gonna talk about closing and these things.
Well, then you promised.
So let's resume.
Yeah.
Okay. So now that we know about this timeline, which one do you think we should use? And let's say we are going after one, what sort of scheduling should be used? So first of all, do you guys have any suggestions on which one is a better choice? If it depends on what. I already said that like okay, row buffer hit is an important part, but how do we decide that?
I guess if you have sequential access, then keeping the row would be better.
Mhm.
Because sequential access, you have more chance of
Yeah,
sharing the same row.
Yeah.
So if you're random, then you close it.
You close it, yeah. And then do you think for like a system that has like very different workloads, which one would be best? Like if I don't know, like your own laptop, do you think it's like the way that you operate your laptop? Would you use a closed row or an open row? Open? Why open?
Well, I think because I just like the way I use my laptop, I can do the same thing.
You could do the same thing, okay, yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, for example, if you're browsing, for example, like open row would be a better idea, right? Okay. But then let's say, for example, we go with open page. Okay, so let's say open is a good option. How do you schedule the requests as they come in? How do you schedule them? Do you do like first come, first serve, or do you do other things? What do you suggest? Like random? What's this? Like, let's say I have 100 requests coming in. Which one do you service first, or why?
I could be wrong, but since it says you want to do it in sequential order as they come in, so
Mhm.
more likely to be in the same frame.
But what if they're not in sequential order? Yeah.
I guess you can batch it so that the ones that share the same row are that. But then I don't know how you satisfy like, I don't know, coherence or whatever. Because don't the order of the read and like writes matter to the application?
The order of, yeah, but we are talking about reads for now.
Just reads and
Yeah,
group them into the ones that are on the same rows.
yeah, so you can actually look into the larger window and try to look at them. But then would that create an issue?
I guess if they're really far apart, then your window has to be really long.
All right, that's one issue. And any other issues? If I keep servicing some requests that are not young, they're old, but they're not in the same row, would that create an issue? Imagine that you're using a browser and your Spotify, and then you keep requesting your browser, but not the Spotify, right? At some point, the Spotify will crash, right? So there's a fairness issue that you need to also be careful about. But yeah, these are good points. So essentially, there are like two simple ones that you can think about. It's first come, first serve. This is what we usually do for memory requests. Like a request comes, we have some queue, we go through the queue, and then we service it, right? It's the same way that you go to a restaurant, you go first come first, right? A slightly better option for DRAM specifically is what we call FRFCS, which is first ready, first come, first serve. First ready, first come, first serve is basically says that, can I utilize my row buffer as much as I can? Which means that I try to first see if the request or any nearby requests will cause a row buffer hit. So if I have requests like this, oops, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. First come, first serve is that like serve this, then serve this, then serve this, and so on and so forth. When what would happen is that, for example, if this one hit in the row buffer, great. If this one is also hit in row buffer, great. But then, for example, there could be a scenario where 3 is not in the same row; it's in another row. But then 4 is actually in this row. So if I switch 3 and 4, I get a row buffer hit for 4, and then I can always close the row and go to 3. So I have to do that for 3 anyway. But then if I do 3 and then 4, I need to close the row twice. So I pay a more penalty. But if I kind of like look through the window for some limited time, of course, I cannot do it infinitely, but for finite size, if I can go through the queue and bring those that are faster and let them go in, then I'm gonna significantly increase my speed. Think about it as like those of you who've been to Disneyland, there's like a group line and the single lines, and singles goes like faster. So it's kind of like that. So those that are mapped to the same row buffer hit, they go faster than what they should have. And the goal here is that you want to maximize the row buffer hit. And then if you think about this is which one goes better, which idea is the first ready first come first serve is good for open row policy, and then first come first serve is basically good for closed row policy, right? In closed row you don't have the row open anyway, so you don't need to do this. But if you have an open row, you want to go with the first ready first come first serve. Okay. But the biggest problem with this first ready first come first serve is technically you can delay a request for many thousands of cycles, just because that the future cycles, the future requests are all happens to be a row buffer hit into that row, right? So if, for example, 3 is in from another row, but 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 2000, which is kind of the maximum, is all in from the same row, then 3 needs to go way before these. So it might take hundreds and thousands of cycles until you actually request 3, which means that if the processor is waiting for that number, terrible for the performance of that particular process. You make the overall time faster, but the particular process would quote unquote starve because the data never comes. Okay. In fact, actually, people have looked at this, and in fact, you can actually use this as an attack. So people have shown this as a vulnerability that I can somehow create some sequence that the stall time of one application just shoots up while the other ones just drastically reduce. So if the adversary can basically control this one, it can basically create a huge overhead for the other one. So it's kind of, it goes under the category of like a denial of service type of attacks, right? So you can create a denial of service, but just keep sending right requests at the right time. So that's a big issue in modern systems. So how do we fix this? Anyone wants to suggest any fix for this? Yeah.
You essentially put a counter on if something's been installed for a while.
Yes. So that's what we can do. So it's some form of a limited fashion of first ready, first come, first serve. It's typically what you can do. You can also leverage parallelism in order to leverage this. So if I can somehow like request this and map this into different banks, then this problem never happens, right? So if all the accesses goes to one bank and the other bank can service the other, I can fix this issue as well. Okay. So beyond this first ready, first come, first serve, there is also other strategies that you can use. There's, for example, round robin you can use, like go from one core and then next core and then next core and so on and so forth. You can do some techniques like power saving, which you close the row and maybe like not even use the row buffer hit and so on. So CA4 will be all about these scheduling techniques. Interesting thing about CA4 is that we're gonna ask you not only just think about performance, but also think about power. So we're gonna actually give you some numbers for the power as well, so you can actually design that way. Yes.
Why does closing the rows power?
So think about this as unnecessary work is an extra power overhead, right? So if I need to keep pre-charging and charging, that will waste power. Also think about that if I actually use a lot of locality, then I'm going to save a lot of power, right? So if I skip the pre-charging part, then I'm going to also save power. So it's both ways. All right, so just kind of like a summary of what we discussed for DRAM. So memory controller, there's a channel. The channel, there are ranks, like for example, like 2 ranks or 4 ranks. Within each rank, then you have banks. Within each bank, you have rows and columns, and then that will give you the generalized memory structure. A little bit more details about the chip itself. As I said, consists of multiple banks. Banks share the commands and data buses. Okay, so it's the same command goes to all the banks at the same time. Typically, as I said before, we cannot have like a large communication bandwidth between each chip to the outside world. That's why we can only at any given time provide 1 byte. This is, as I said, it's mostly for physical reasons, that we didn't have enough, in order to like have a lot of pins, it's like a pin problem, right? So if you want to have a lot of pins, you have to figure that out. And since there are 2 DIMMs and multiple columns and so on and so forth, that's a huge problem. And then, as I said, usually the naming interfaces that we call this module DIMM is because we have this dual lane techniques, and then all the chips in one side and the other side is like 1 chip on the other side is called 1 rank, and then the other side is called another rank. And then, as I said, each chip is 8-bit interface. That's a pretty standard, and it's still the standard these days. And then the important thing is that for banks, you can have concurrency, because then these are providing different data. Which can help you with improving the overall end-to-end time. But if you want to have a true parallelism, then that's where you're going to have multiple channels. That's why you have channels and multiple different SRAM slots. That gives you an increased bus bandwidth. So if I want to bring a lot of data, the only way that I can do this is by increasing my channels. So just keep that in mind. And again, high-end systems has lots of these channels that it can bring data. Later on, when we're going to discuss like heterogeneous systems in week 10, you're going to see that there's kind of a new technologies or technologies that are kind of either 3D. So these days, people have figured out ways to put the memory on top of the CPU. This way, you have many bits that can go into like many pins that can go into the CPU. And that way you can have many channels, right? So you can actually have much faster memory, much more higher bandwidth memory. Not the latency is still the same because the inherent technology here is the same, but I can provide more data for a given time, right? So my bandwidth can be increased. For example, another thing that Apple has these days is their CPU and their memory is part of this thing they call Fabric. And again, this Fabric is nothing but a faster way to like just send more pins to the CPU. So they use newer technology to be able to increase this number of pins into their design. So again, that's the key reason that many of these systems, like for example, machine learning based systems and all are faster. And also keep in mind that for the type of workload that we are dealing with these days, bringing more data is very important. So in the past, you could not so for example, if you think about your browser, what makes your browser faster is not bringing more data. In some very specific cases, it might help, but in most cases, it's really the latency itself, right? But if I need to bring a lot of data, so if I need to like train a large language model, I need to bring a lot of data. So then latency is not an issue. The bandwidth is the main issue. So be careful about the difference between these kind of workloads that you have in your systems. Okay. This is just a kind of a graphic of like how this multiple banking can help, right? As you can see, if if my addresses keep like, mapped into the different banks, it's kind of like would look like this. But if I can actually parallelize this banking activities that like you can issue the address 1 to bank 1 and address the address 0 to bank 0, address 1 to bank 1, address 2 to bank 3, then the nice thing that could happen is that I can then interleave this request. So I kind of like it's the same way that we did pipelining. If I can somehow pipeline this, then essentially the delay that I'm going to see is not the full delay, is only the difference between these two consecutive requests. Okay, still I cannot send two data at the same time. I have limited bandwidth, but the latency will be significantly reduced. So just keep that in mind. And then again, if I have multiple channels, I can do this now in the concurrent fashion. So now the question is, okay, if I want to achieve this kind of concurrency, what is the right way of mapping the addresses to the bank and rows and ranks? You can think about it in various ways. So for example, you can say that, okay, the most significant bits select the rows, then the next 3 bits select the banks, then the columns, and then the bytes. But then you can also like do something like, okay, I put the rows here, I put the column, banks, low columns, and bytes here. So essentially I break down the column into 2 pieces so that the banks are going here. Why would I want to do that? Essentially, the reason is that consecutive addresses, if they map into different banks, that's where I'm going to get more benefit, right? I want the low columns as well because I want to also have that my row buffer hit. So it's kind of like, I need a little bit of spatial locality for my row buffer hit. I also need a little bit of spatial locality for my banks. And then I put the columns there on the other side of the system. But then for random access and all, this won't work, right? So it's not going to help you that much with that. This is just like how you play with your addresses and how with your mapping, right? So you want to maximize the dependency between the banks, but you also want to maximize the chance of row buffer hits. So 2 things to keep in mind. Okay, this is just an example of how this actually helps. You can actually, for example, one thing you can do is that in order to even further increase the randomness of bank assignments, you can do things such as like some form of a hashing. If I can actually do hashing, then if this sequence becomes the bank's index, then it's highly likely that it's this uniformly distributed across all the 3 bits that I have. So there are these tricks that people also use. Last thing I want to talk about DRAM before moving on to Rowhammer is DRAM refresh. As I said earlier, a DRAM capacitor unfortunately leaks over time. Even if we don't read it, it's still gonna leak. The way that we do this to fix this is reading periodically all the rows and refresh all the rows. In terms of the timeline, you can think about this as an activate and the pre-charge. We don't need to do the RAS and CAS anymore. We just do the activate and the pre-charge because we don't need to read the values. We just need to replace it. What's the impact on for DRAM refresh on the performance? Unfortunately, when we are refreshing a bank, that bank is not going to be usable for any other activity. So periodically, a bank will be out of service for some time for the refresh to happen. We interleave this between the banks of different chips so that other banks can work. So hopefully you can actually hide the entire latency of a bank by this, because refresh one bank, the other 7 banks can be used. But there's a chance that at that time, that particular bank is being refreshed. So another trick that you can actually use for scheduling is figuring out which bank is being refreshed and try to service other requests from the other banks. So that's another part of the servicing as well. Okay. Another question that comes to mind is, should I refresh all the rows all at the same time, like a kind of a bursty behavior? or should I like, do one row and then do nothing, like, service and then go back? The idea is that, for example, if someone really, really needs this bank, if I go through all the rows in this bank, it means that for a long time, I cannot use this bank, right? But one thing I can do is that I say, okay, I refresh this row, then I service any request, then I refresh this row, then I refresh this row, and so on and so forth. So this is like the difference between kind of a bursty behavior versus kind of like a more of a distributed behavior. In reality, most systems does both. So if it can detect that, if it can predict that this bank is not going to be used in near future, it's actually beneficial to do this, because that means that there's the probability of some collision will be high, versus this one is like, oh, this time I need to refresh, but then there is a long time that nothing happens, so I can service. So if I can magically know when this bank going to be used, then I can schedule this bursty behavior. So this detecting when is the right time for refresh is also like an important question in a scheduling of these DRAMs. Okay, any questions? Yep.
I have a dumb question. I think on a couple of slides ago, you mentioned bandwidth.
Uh-huh.
What does bandwidth mean in this context specifically?
So bandwidth means that how much data I can bring for a unit of time. Okay. So for example, I told you that I can bring 8 bytes for one access, right? So if I want to bring 64 bytes, I need to do this 8 times. Okay. So, but if I tell you that, oh, I have a newer technology that instead of 8 bytes, I can bring 64 bytes. So my system now becomes 8 times faster, right? And this is purely technology. So like the reason that we can do 8 or 64 or more, like why we cannot do the other, is just the technology. If my technology can support a 64-byte data communication, then I'll do 64-byte. But keep in mind that the time it takes to do this versus the time it takes to do this is usually very similar, right? So one axis is the same. How much can I bring with one axis is the difference. Think about like a bus that goes from here to like point A to point B. The number of people that I can bring is the bandwidth. The time it takes is the length. Okay. All right. So last thing I want to talk about is row hammer. How many of you are familiar with the concept of row hammer? Okay, it's good. So row hammer is actually very, very interesting observation in DRAM systems. It's type of a physical attack. It's type of like a fault attack. So yeah, the adversary is actually using the way that the DRAM operates in order to flip bits. And people have shown that you can actually flip bits at will. So you can actually flip any bits that you want. So how does it work? So the idea of row hammer is they found that if I actually access not the exact row that I want to access, but the nearby rows, the amount of leakage in the row in between increases. Okay, so if I have, let's say, 3 rows, okay, if I access this row and I access this row, what they found out was that the leakage of this row grows. Why? Because of some form of a coupling that is happening. Because these rows are very, like these transistors are physically very close to each other. So it's actually what happens is that as this kind of like rows keep switching, then this one is the leakage just grows. Okay. So what will happen? So essentially, like think about it this way. So as I said, there's a leakage, right? So typically, in order to fix this leakage, this is how it operates, right? So think about this as the voltage of that capacitor. So at the refresh time is at 100%. And as I told you, as the time, so this is time. As the time goes by, the voltage drops because the amount of charge stored in the capacitance drops. As the charge drops, the voltage drops. Okay, so the voltage kind of drops. But then, if I can refresh this cell sooner than it drops to 0, then I can recover. Okay, so this is what happens. So the refresh immediately, like restore the power. and then drops, restore, power, restore, and then it's good. This is how it operates normally. So the reason that you decide, okay, this is the right time for refreshing is that you expect this leakage rate to be some specific number, right? So you make some assumptions. You don't want to refresh too often because that's wastes a lot of time. Also, I already discussed that refreshing often means that the bank will be unusable during that time. So you want to extend this time as much as possible, but you cannot extend it too much because then you will lose the voltage, right? You will lose the values. So you want to find the optimum one. But then the interesting thing is that they found that if I keep closing and opening a row, then the adjacent row is going to be leaking faster. Okay, that's the fundamental thing about this thing. So if I keep closing and opening this row 1, row 3, and to some extent row 0 and row 4 going to be impacted. These are called victim rows. They're going to actually discharge faster. This is kind of like the distance between them. As I said, the next week I'm going to talk more about the details of the row hammer and these definitions. But this is essentially what we call a single-sided row hammer attack, which I keep opening and closing this one, and I'm trying to flip bits here. Okay. Alternatively, if the adversary has access to this one and this one, then they can much faster flip bits here because from both sides they are kind of like impacting this row. So basically, what happens is this: that if I keep opening and closing, this drops much faster. And these are the times that the row hammer happens. So as you see, it's like any time that we open and close a row of an adjacent one, there will be a slightly more drop in the charge of the current row. And then as a result, by the time that you are going to refresh, the value is here, okay? The value is here. And then since this value is less than the voltage min, the refresh will think that this value was 0, so it's actually pre-charged it to 0. So at that point, it's even worse. So like once the refresh comes, then the value would be exactly 0, not even close to 0. It would be exactly 0. And then the next refresh has no idea. It sees 0, it thinks that it's 0, so it continues 0. So basically, the value of 1 would be completely destroyed. Okay? Yeah.
I'm still confused. So why exactly is that affecting the victim, or is it because like electromagnetic reason?
Yeah, so it's because of the electrical charge coupling. So think about this as so yeah, these transistors, right? So they're all connected to some bit line, right? If I keep opening and closing this bit line, think about this as the capacitance of this line changes. As the capacitance of this line changes, the rate at which this charge is going to be discharged changes. Okay, so that's how it kind of this is impacted. There are some very good articles that goes really through the physics of row hammer, which I'm not going to go through. But generally, it's because of the electrical components of the DRAM, because they are very close. And unfortunately, what happens with row hammer is that as we are going to smaller technology, it gets worse. Because the transistor sizes get smaller, the charge gets smaller, the number of transistors gets more, and the distance between the transistor also gets smaller. So the row hammer issue is one issue that's actually getting worse as we move forward. Any other questions? Yeah.
How do you write a 1? Because it looks like you're just resetting to 0.
You're resetting it to 0, yeah. So you discharge, but you can always also think about you can technically, like, if there is a leakage, the opposite way is also possible. But typically, you want to usually just flip 1 to 0. That's the most case that you do this. Yeah, there are works that do 0 to 1. I'm going to show you next time as well. Important thing about row hammer is that this does not work on all the cells. There is a cell-to-cell variation. Why? Because if you, for example, think about like a black cell, a blue cell, and a green cell, the amount of leakage in each one is slightly different. It's this thing called process variation, that not any two transistors are similar, even though that we build them together, their physical characteristics is not going to be the same. Okay, as a result, their electrical behavior, including their leakage and the amount of coupling that they have and so on will be different. So for example, this green one is still vulnerable to roll hammer, but as you can see, the amount of leakage that it has is much smaller than this black one, right? As a result, even though that the attacker keep accessing this, still at the point that the refresh comes, this is still above the V min, right? And then so as a result, this recovers and then survive, while the blue and the black is not going to survive, right? So raw hammer is actually tricky. So they found that not all the bits are equal, and then it's not going to be successful all the time for all the bits. So just keep that in mind, that these are it's a process variation dependent. Yes.
Is there any sort of like physical or like anything on like the process level they can do to alleviate that? Or is it
Yeah, so there are tons of papers on like the physical layer as well. We're gonna actually talk about them a lot in the next lecture. We're gonna go very deep into both the attacks and defenses. There will be also papers, presentations for you guys that you're gonna do. So you're gonna see a little bit more. Just wait for the next lecture so that I will talk about that. Yeah. But there are, let me see actually. So let me actually talk about the challenges. I'm going to talk about the defense a little bit as well. So there are a whole bunch of challenges, both at the software level and the hardware level. So keep in mind that, okay, just because that you can flip bits, that doesn't automatically give you something useful, right? So there are a whole bunch of the software layer of the attack that needs to happen. So for example, I need to know where this address is mapped, what this address is doing, and so on and so forth. So for example, what I really need to do is some form of think about privilege escalation. Remember I told you that almost all the processor has like a root level access and user level access. There's usually one bit. If I can somehow flip that bit, then they can do interesting things, right? So, and that bit is going to be stored somewhere in that memory, right? But if I can find that and then run my Brawlhammer attack on that, then I can do something useful. So, like, how do I do that? And how do I find that address? And where is that address is stored? How do I select that particular bit? And a whole bunch of things is actually, there's lots of steps for that. And that is all like the software layer of this Brawlhammer attacks. That is very interesting and useful to know. But just keep in mind that just flipping bits itself is not going to be enough. Another thing that you have to keep in mind is that many of the accesses is going to be row buffer hits. So even if as an adversary keep accessing the same address, it's not going to create a row hammer effect because it will be keep hitting in the row buffer. So it's not going to actually accessing, because you want to close and open a row, right? If I can close and open a row, then I have the row hammer effect. If I cannot open close a row, then nothing happens. So that's another thing that the adversary needs to somehow figure out a way to kind of bypass the row buffer. There is, as I said, there is a single side versus double side row buffer row hammer attacks that we're going to talk with it. And as I said, the last thing is what can I do with it? And we're going to talk about that as well. There's a whole bunch of works on new attacks. This is still a very active area of research. If causing more damage. There is another thing called row buffer attacks and so on and so forth. There's another thing called row press. Then it's instead of row hammer, it's called row press. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in the next lecture. And as I said, a presentation is going to talk about that as well. And then there's a whole bunch of the defense mechanisms. We're going to talk about that. So there are various things that you can do. You can do defend. You can use software solutions to protect your system. You can use error correction methods because ultimately this is a fault, and we already know how to fix the faults. So you can actually use error detection. You can also detect this behavior if someone is closing and opening a particular row, then you probably can be able to detect that. And then you can also, as someone says, you can also change the hardware. One last thing that I want to say before I let you guys go is Rollhammer is actually a family of a bigger problem in systems called fault attacks. These are generally physical phenomena to inject some faulty behavior in the CPU or the memory. There are other types of false attacks, including like things like, oh, people have shown that if I change the voltage, then it will cause some bit flips, and that bit flips could cause some attacks to the system. Other people have shown that if I change the clock speed, then that will also create some bit flips. Some other people have shown that if they inject a strong amount of electromagnetic emanation or some laser, or like suddenly change the temperature of the system, that will also create lots of these systems. Again, these are important. This goes under the category of what they call electronic warfare, that U.S. Army particularly is very interested, because think about battlefield, and you think about like your F-35 is using all these computers, and someone can flip bits, right? So you don't need to like necessarily shoot it. These days, you can just, if you can flip bits in a computer, you can also like crash it into the ground. So there are a whole bunch of these important questions about the safety and the correct operations of the system that you also need to know. We're not going to talk about these. In my previous class, I talked about it a little bit, not in the context of computer architecture, but in general. But just this Brawlhammer is going to be an example of that we're going to talk a little bit more about next time. All right, I think that's it. Any questions? All right, I'm going to be, oh yeah.
I have a kind of random question.
Yeah.
Is it generally better to have more sticks of RAM or like slots than like just more RAM? Like say, maybe you have less RAM on 4 like slots versus more RAM on 2 slots.
If your workload is gonna use more bandwidth, then more slots gonna help you. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. It's just more RAM is important.
Okay.
That's all. Like for your own personal purpose, it's probably, if you're not using multi-thread applications, then just more RAM. Either case, whichever is cheaper.
But for bandwidth, like.
Yeah, for bandwidth, then you want more RAM. All right, thank you.